GSM survivor and a champion from Kenya. Today, I want to appeal to all G7 member states to fund the African women who are on the front line to end gender-based violence, especially female genital mutilation.
Money goes to big organizations, big NGOs, which are situated in most cases in the cities or in other parts of the world.
We would like the G7 to fund African women working on the front line by investing in digital transformation. We are already using such technology to address issues such as gender-based violence, sexual reproductive health rights, and tackling harmful traditional practices.
What if the scars were visible on the face? 200 million survivors are suffering in silence, and no one makes ending FGM a priority.
The G7 leaders are the ones that have power, but my message is to women on the ground. You must lead the change by your own power. You must be the masters of your own destiny.
Fund the grassroots organizations that have been rescuing, providing a home, and spending their limited resources, feeding and seeking justice for the vulnerable girls.
Trust us with your money. We will deliver. We will achieve zero FGM. Thank you so much.
Welcome everybody, both those in person and online, to this G7 warm-up event, Financing Africa's Female Future. And the aim of this event is to push support, including from the private sector, directly to women on the continent, to promote African-led solutions and to promote Africa as a strategic investment partner and not solely a recipient of aid. And the activists you saw in the video are partners of the CIFF Foundation, which is hosting the event today. And we're now going to have a panel discussion, and not that anybody on the panel needs introduction, but we're very, very lucky to have Nimco Ali, who's the CEO and co-founder of the CIFF Foundation, the Global Partnership to End FGM. She's also an author, a campaigner, and, as she puts it, a part-time troublemaker. We're also very privileged to have the Right Honourable Priti Patel, the UK Home Secretary, and joining us virtually is Vera Songwe, who's the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. And later on, we'll also be hearing a short intervention from the Right Honourable Liz Truss, the UK Secretary of State for International Trade, Women and Equalities. So she'll be making an appearance a bit later on. Nimco, if we can start with you. What prompted the CIFF Foundation to organise this event, and what do you expect from the UK government in terms of it being the host of the G7 summit? What do you expect from it?
I won't say what I expect from it because I don't want to hold Priti accountable for that. But ultimately, the reason why we wanted to do this is the fact that Africa's future is female. And fundamentally, we talk about things like poverty as though they're just things that happen, but 50% of Africa's economic capital, women, are being underutilised, if not utilised at all. And then at the same time, we have issues such as FGM, child marriage, and girls being out of education. So if we are really going to be able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, we have to be able to look towards Africa's female future. And as an African woman, as a woman who understands that, as a survivor of the 200 million women who've had FGM, I only know the fact that I'm in the position that I am today because I was economically empowered and I was able to make my own money. And there's a very uncomfortable conversation about the conversation around money and Africa. And I thought, you know what, this is a position where I can use my platform in order to put that forward.
Great, thank you very much, Nimco. And now, if I can turn to the Minister. As we all know, gender-based violence is a major problem in the UK and globally. And as Nimco has kind of let the world know, in some parts of Africa, FGM has affected more than 90% of women. And how do you think, how is the UK and other G7 members going to ensure that funding gets to the women activists in Africa who are fighting to end FGM and other forms of violence?
Well, look, first of all, I've got to say thank you to everyone for hosting this really important debate and discussion today, and also to Nimco and the CIFF Foundation. FGM in its own right is just one of the most abhorrent practices that still exists in the world. And you've asked within the context of the G7, how are we going to get the cash there? You know, right to the front line to make a difference. Let's just cut to the chase. You know, forget all the bureaucracy and all the stuff that goes on in the middle. For us, this is very much about actually working with the right kind of partners, the right advocates to ensure that we can stop FGM. But actually, it goes wider than that as well, to absolutely deal with this issue head on about violence against women and girls. And I don't say this just sitting here as the UK Home Secretary. Clearly, this applies to us domestically. But we're speaking about this right now within the framework of the SDGs, but also our place in the world, global Britain. We're hosting the G7. We hold the presidency right now. We've got a very, very set of important meetings taking place over the next few days. We have consistently, and I can say this from my previous days in DFID as well, we have been world leaders. I've been there, seen it and done it actually in terms of Africa, going to countries in Africa, going to the front line, meeting actually survivors, not dissimilar to the video that we saw here today, and actually putting British money right down, you know, in the communities with the type of partner organisations that can deal with safeguarding, protection, education, but actually something that is equally as important that runs in parallel, which is empowerment. Empowerment of our girls, empowerment of women so that they can have a better life. And, you know, we have to look at anything to do with violence against women and girls. Yes, within that sort of protective element, yes, recognising their victims, they're vulnerable, but actually giving them a new future going forward. And I think that is just so important.
And we have now people like Nimco who are bravely speaking out, raising the issue, really promoting efforts to stop it. But in terms of the G7 and Britain in particular, what's going to be different this time? Because there's now quite a big conversation, much more than there used to be. It's not such a taboo issue.
Sure.
But how, in the next couple of years, do you see real change taking place in terms of that practice?
Well, if I may, I think there are a couple of things. So you've mentioned FGM as a taboo issue, cultural and all that stuff that, to be fair, the work of Nimco and others have absolutely shattered. And therefore, from a British perspective, look at the changes that we've had in our own laws, domestic legislation, you know, public health awareness, education. We've got to move that up, absolutely re-gear that. And it's got to be consistent around the world. So yes, we hold the pen for the G7, and Global Britain will be a leader in this. Global Britain has led on this issue, in my view, absolutely. But convening the G7 also means getting some of the other leaders as well to put, you know, their money where their mouth is, but also looking at their own work in countries as well, Africa and other parts of the world, and how we can be consistent in our shared aims and objectives. That's effectively what the Sustainable Development Goals are all about as well. Not everyone doing 25 different things, but actually having one vision, looking for the right kind of outcomes and objectives, and how we can support the international community to deliver on those outcomes.
And before we turn to Dr. Vera Songwe, Nimco, I think you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to intersect in the sense that it's not just about ending FGM as a practice of FGM. So between now and 2030, there are 70 million girls at risk of FGM. Those 70 million girls haven't been born, and if they are born, they're going to be born to adolescent girls who have been trafficked and sold into marriage. We have to be able to change the economic landscape of Africa. I think that's the fundamental basis of that. FGM can only end when women have the economic and the choices that are able to make over their bodies. So I don't want us to be specifically focused on the realities of FGM, but rather the realities of and that women are living with on the ground.
And that's a very good moment to turn to Dr. Vera Songwe, the Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, because what I wanted to put to you is what can the G7 do for African economies that will particularly benefit women, and then maybe help to stop practices, enable them to stop practices like FGM and all sorts of other issues that they face?
First of all, let me thank Nimco for having me here, and of course to say hello to Priti and Liz, who will come on soon. This is a very, very important conversation, and I'm really happy and pleased to be having this conversation. I think the first thing, as Nimco just said, is really, you know, we need to look at it at the macro level. The population of the continent today is 1.3 billion people, of which at least 750 are women. And the first thing the G7 should do is look at how we put liquidity how we put financing into the hands of these women. I think in the beginning with the G20, we got the debt service suspension initiative that allowed governments to very quickly respond to the crisis by providing some liquidity. $5 billion it was in 2020. We've had $3.5 billion in the first half of 2021, and we hope something similar in the second half. But that has not nearly been enough for what we need, because the link between providing this kind of liquidity to government and the private sector and girls that stay out of school, and because they stay out of school, get sent into marriage, is almost one-to-one, as Nimco and Shriti, who has been on the ground, know. So we need to ensure that first our governments have the resources, and secondly, that we can keep girls at school. And I think that when the G20 begins to think about what can it do, is, how can we put more liquidity into the hands of African states? How can we allow African states to make the decisions that will allow them to do the things that hurt women the most? The second thing that hurts women the most, and which the G20 can help with, and we saw the Prime Minister yesterday or 2 days ago talk about a G7 Marshall Plan for a green economy, is really beginning to look at how we build forward and how we build into a green economy. We have shown with studies that we did with Oxford University that building into a green economy actually supports women, actually ensures that, again, as Nimco said, this is first and foremost about women's economic empowerment. If a woman is economically empowered, her daughter is economically empowered, and so is the granddaughter. So we need to make sure that financing comes down that road. Finally, what we have seen with this crisis of COVID-19 is that the digital economy, though it has sort of exploded on the continent, has created huge inequalities. Today, we have about 73% of African women who have access to phones, but they do not have access to the internet, so they cannot create their own businesses. The G20 can help us to fast-track digitization. A lot of these things go through funding, UN, United Nations institutions, UNAIDS, UN Women, UNFPA. And so we really hope that, the UK government can reconsider some of the cuts that it has put to women. We understand we've gone through a global recession, the whole world is suffering, but maybe there is ways where we can collectively think about how we put more resources into the hands of African governments, African private sector in particular. The small and medium enterprises on the continent are mostly run by women, and I think institutions like CDC and the rest in the UK are doing a fantastic job, and we could do more if we had the right amount of resources for them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Songwe. And before we hear from the Right Honourable Liz Truss, Nimco, if I can just ask you another question. Do you trust the UK and the other G7 nations to deliver on their commitments and actually institute changes that will really bring about real, meaningful change for women on the African continent?
Yes, but that might be because I'm an optimist. But at the same time is the fact that it is actually in the interest of G7 countries in order to invest in Africa's female future. As Vera was just saying, the fact that the population of Africa is 1.3 billion, it's going to hit the 2 billion mark because women are going to be trafficked and they're going to be sold as baby-making machines. So if we do want to be able to stop Africa from hitting the 2 billion mark, we want to be able to stop somewhere like Nigeria from going to the 500 million mark, we have to be able to invest in Africa. So I do believe, for example, I do believe that the UK government and the French government are both very pro-Africa, but I also know that it's for their best interest in order to do that. So I think it's a two-way approach in the sense that I'm optimistic about the real commitments that they have, but at the same time, people like me have to make the case for the fact that it is for the West's good to invest in Africa.
Absolutely, Nimco. You need to keep going. You need to keep shouting. We're now going to hear via video from the Secretary of State for International Development, the Right Honourable Liz Truss.
As chair of the G7 this year, we will be relentlessly pursuing our priorities, the 3 E's: educating girls, empowering women, and ending violence against women and girls. And the G7 countries under our leadership will be agreeing steps to enhance the flow of trade with Africa, with an emphasis on supporting African business women. In Africa, more women than men choose to become entrepreneurs. And if you look at cross-border trade from Rwanda, 80% is done by women-led businesses, while 60% of cross-border trade in Botswana is conducted by women. This is about being able to control your own life and chart your own future. It's about independence, and it's about being able to help yourself and your family. And that's what I want for women, both here in the United Kingdom and internationally. I'm also looking ahead to the Generation Equality Forum in Paris later this month. And I'm pleased that the UK has been able to work with our co-leads to create an ambitious package of commitments under the Action Coalition on gender-based violence. This is an important year for the UK, and we have a duty to ensure that we use the opportunities that we have to change the status quo, to build back better, and to ensure that women and girls everywhere are given the means of their own empowerment. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Liz Truss. As we draw to a close, if I could ask the Right Honourable Minister, in terms of there's been quite a lot of talk of trying to promote private investment as well as international aid to make Africa into a proper, respected trading partner, not just a recipient of aid. And in terms of women and girls, how do you see those two things fitting into each other? We've heard about how women are the kind of economic backbone of Africa, even though we might not see them that often in the news. But how would you marry those two things together?
So for me, they go hand in hand. I was the first Secretary of State in DFID that did the economic development strategy for women and for Africa. And alongside that, our Prime Minister is just so passionate about girls' education. Look at the way in which he's championed that as Foreign Secretary, now as Prime Minister. We're hosting the replenishment of that very, very soon. Now, of course, we want girls and women to be able to stand on their own 2 feet, and that does mean capital. It does mean that dose of injecting capital markets, liquidity, as Vera said as well. And there is something else here which links to the public sector, i.e. the money that we put in terms of taxes. Vera mentioned CDC, so the recapitalisation of CDC that took place of £12 billion was enormous. And if you look at the business plans that they put together, that's all about jobs, economic growth, trade opportunities. And then, of course, famously, we have a range of international financial institutions, some of which are linked to the UN, the World Bank, the various development banks, the African development banks. We put money into those banks, those institutions. That money needs to come out and it needs to be used directly to invest in education of girls, but also in terms of job creation. And that's not necessarily, the big industrial plants. Microfinance, let's go back to basics. Look at what microfinance has done in parts of Kenya, for example. Innovations like M-Pesa and the whole aspect of, how do you do those transactions digitally in a very smart and savvy way and give women and girls a chance to have a livelihood, which basically will stop them from, as Nimco has said, and I see this in my job as Home Secretary, being trafficked, being vulnerable, ending up, somehow in such terrible, terrible circumstances and situations. That's what we want to stop. And there are a lot of resources out there that can be fused together to absolutely drive the right kind of outcomes.
And Nimco, to round off, in terms of the advice that you would give the G7 if you could go and say to them, what is the most important thing that you can do this year? And what can we learn from mistakes of the past? What would be your message?
I want to say change is possible, but it's not inevitable. And in order for us to be able to do that, we have to be brave, and we have to be brave enough to do things differently. And ultimately, it's about putting money in the hands of women. I consistently hear the fact that it's really hard to fund women, it's really hard to fund African women specifically, but it's never been done before. So I need them to be brave, and I need them to understand that the trajectory of humanity can change if we actually empower 50% of Africa's population, and it can be done. And I do actually look to both Macron, Boris, Prime Minister Johnson and Trudeau in order to be able to do that. And I do actually believe that they can. So the whole thing is that there is an opportunity for them to do things differently, and the opportunity is now.
And in terms of that money getting, as you want to push for, directly to the women activists in Africa, rather than going through international institutions who somehow end up with quite a lot of that funding, how do you practically, how do you think that's going to happen?
Well, that's what the next panel is about. It's about incredible women and incredible organisations that are able to actually, with as little as 2% overhead, in order to be able to change and empower people. I sit here today because I was educated and I was able to make my own money, and then I was able to lobby secretaries of state to the point where I can sit as a first-generation immigrant woman with the Secretary of State and be her independent advisor. That kind of possibility is tangible, but we have to be able to be brave. And I know I say that quite consistently, but I think it is the whole point of actually just giving young African women the opportunities to be able to fulfill their potential.
Great. Well, thank you very much to our whole panel. We could go on for ages, but the time has run out. So please join me in thanking Nimco Ali, the Right Honourable Priti Patel, Dr. Vera Songwe, and the Right Honourable Liz Truss, and of course the Five Foundation for hosting this great event. So thank you very much to all of you. And before the next panel, we're going to have a short video from the Five Foundation itself before we go on to this nitty-gritty discussion about how money can reach women directly on the continent.
We've strengthened the law on FGM. We're helping communities around the world to end this appalling crime that scars young girls for the rest of their lives, both physically and mentally.
I think everyone in their right senses should care about FGM. There's 200 million women and girls across the world that are living with something that would impact them in so many ways. It's a huge human rights violation. Remember, this happens to young girls. Something is taken away from them without their consent, without even understanding what is being taken away from them. We're humans and we have a moral obligation to make sure that this doesn't get passed on to the next generation.
In my community, all the girls are cut on the day of the wedding. That's what they believe, that once she's cut, now she becomes a woman, even if she's 9 years. In Kenya, we are lucky because it's illegal. And I feel that message just needs to get to the village, like house to house. So for us, our aim is just to educate the community that it's wrong, and at the end of the day, to show them the value of the girls. That's why we take those girls to school and show them even when girls are not cut, they become healthier and they go to school and they become better people even than men.
More than anything else, I believe that ending FGM is possible in my generation. Not the generation after me, not my daughter's generation, but in my generation. If there's anything that I believe, it's that.
Should say thank you to the BBC's Mary Harper as well for moderating that first part of the discussion on financing Africa's female future. The second part coming up in just a moment, and a powerful film there to end it. Certainly resonates with me. I have two daughters, 9 and 11. The idea of FGM is not even in their realm of understanding, but the fact in this, the third decade of the 21st century, it's still happening. It's still affecting millions of girls in Africa is unfortunately mind-blowing. It's unbelievable that it still happens, Carthy.
It is. It's very sad, but I was very pleased to hear, particularly Nimco Ali, feeling quite optimistic about the future, hearing from the panel there about the way that things are moving forward. And I think that's something that we want to bring forward here at Gold's House as well, isn't it? The confidence in the future and optimism as well for the future. That's something we're going to be talking about a bit more in the second part of the Financing Africa's Female Future panel. This one particularly addressing funding to the grassroots women's activists. So let's get to this next panel session on financing the future of Africa's females.
Hello and welcome to this panel discussion on financing Africa's female future. We just had an incredible first panel there with Nimco and the Home Secretary as well. And this is all about how the financing actually gets to the ground and to African women. I'm Janet Mbugua, I'm your moderator, and an incredible group of panelists who I will now be introducing and then directing my questions to. First up, I'd like to start with Faustina. Faustina Fynn-Nyame is the Executive Director for Africa of the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, or CIFF, leading the development and execution of the strategy across Africa and strengthening and scaling up their partnerships and impact. It's great to have you with us, Faustina. And then we have Latanya Mapp-Frett. She is President and CEO of Global Fund for Women, previously Executive Director of Planned Parenthood Global. Latanya, great to have you with us. And then our next panelist is Gabrielle Fitzgerald. She is the founder and CEO of Panorama, an action tank dedicated to achieving ambitious goals and solving the world's toughest problems. Gabrielle, great to have you with us on this panel. And then we have Alfonsina Penaloza, who is the Director for Programs of Co-Impact, leading the Latin American and global grant making, and brings more than 20 years of experience in gender development and public policy. Alfonsina, thank you so much for being with us today. And finally, we have Emelia Atta-Fynn. She's the head of Group Microfinance of Ecobank Group. Until her appointment as Managing Director of Pan-African Savings and Loans Company, she was Executive Director and Head Domestic Bank of Ecobank Zambia. Ladies, thank you so much. It's such an important, timely conversation. We've heard some of the comments there. Trust us with your money from one of the videos that we saw there earlier on. And of course, Nimco emphasizing, be brave. Let's do things differently because we need different results. And so I'd like to start with you, Faustina. And one of the pillars of the Children's Investment Fund Foundation Africa strategy is for Africans, by Africans. Tell me a little bit more about how that works in terms of how you make funding decisions.
Thank you so much. And it was wonderful hearing Nimco and the Honourable Secretary talk a little bit just beforehand. But at Children Investment Fund Foundation, how we've been making sure that we For Africa by Africa pillar really delivers is around putting African women and girls at the center of all of our grant making and our decision making. We have ensured that, through our strategy and work with our partners to gain real insights into solving problems from the root cause. We are not interested in doing grant making that has been done, for decades now. We want to do things differently. And so we believe that the solution lies within the communities that we're trying to serve. We do not believe that we have the answers, whether I'm sitting in Nairobi or in Addis Ababa or, somewhere else in West Africa. We believe that, the communities that we want to serve, we work with them directly in designing our strategies, designing the projects and so forth, and work through our partners to fund those. And we absolutely believe that for Africa, to be a self-determining, right? We have to unlock this 50% of the population right now who have not had the opportunities to contribute to the economic development of Africa. And it's not also, this pillar that we're talking about is not about funding through endless, NGOs, whether it is international NGOs. It's about, funding the most local, the most responsive organizations that are grassroots and are near to the populations that we're trying to serve, right? And so it is not just also about, we have to build and make sure that we give the same opportunities. There's been a real imbalance for so many years in Africa around who gets access to funding. And it's usually the ones who are able to write the best papers, who have got the connections with the different organizations, are the ones who always get funded. So, but we know majority of the work is done by actually grassroots organization. We have to learn from them, we have to trust them, and we have to be able to fund them in the same consistent manner we have funded others. And it's also about building Africa institutions, whether it's regional bodies like that Vera is from, or whether it is also government institutions, because, for us to have sustainable, impactful programming that lasts beyond a particular funder, those institutions need to be able to scale, and those institutions need to be able to sustain. And so it's about also funding them to do their work, right? And I think there's also a misunderstanding that, African governments are just not interested in some development areas. And I think that that's not the case at all. By actually engaging them and prioritizing our funding and our priorities with their priorities, I think that we can take things to scale. I think that, things are more impactful and more sustainable.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Faustina. Some really incredible points there about putting women at the center, aligning with governments as well, really critical in changing the funding dynamics. Latanya, as one of the oldest and best known women's funds, Global Fund for Women has set the standard in terms of movement strengthening of grassroots groups. Can you talk about that in the African context and any lessons you've learned, and also what you'd like to do next?
Yeah, thank you so much, Janet. And I'm probably going to echo Faustina here, because it's not that we're guessing the solution is supporting grassroots women's organizations. We've been doing it for 35 years. And in Africa specifically, we funded more than 1,000 grassroots feminist groups. And we know that it works. And specifically, I just want to talk about some that have been, exceptional. Akili Dada was seeded by Global Fund for Women, and we all know that they work on comprehensive sexual and reproductive health education in Kenya. And so when we talk about, making available educational and economic opportunities, we know we can't do that without bodily autonomy. We've been with Lima Goboe. Her organization, Women in Peace Network in Liberia, of course, was one of the first that we funded. And then UHA, which is Africa's first indigenous activist fund for and by LGBTQI people, gender minorities, and sex workers. That's the kind of work that we're talking about. And, and we're a network of probably more than 40 women's funds around the world. And so we've seen that this model is not just works globally, but it works regionally, and it works nationally, and it works across thematic areas. We know at Global Fund for Women that funding bold gender justice movements create this meaningful change that lasts far beyond our lifetime. And we do this by funding these grassroots organizations and movements for gender justice because we want long-term change. And that's the kind of funding that really works, right? Specifically by funding local leaders to pursue the change they seek and the work they prioritize. And then you've got to provide them flexible funding so they can adapt and they can respond to opportunities and crises. And then you begin to shift power, and change is driven by these grassroots people power, and it becomes over time sustained progress. And so Global Fund for Women It believes that transformational social change comes from movements that are led by those that are the most impacted and marginalized. So when we talk about the importance of African women, we mean they are the ones that have to determine the strategy as they move forward. And this is the moment, right? This is our moment to step up. We're in the time of COVID and the rise of movements like Black Lives Matter, where we can all step up by giving activists the funding that they need to drive this transformative change. And so Global Fund for Women is really urging G7 members and all donor countries to scale up and not dismantle, right? And get this critical funding for locally driven solutions that shift power and allow all of us to thrive. Funding grassroots feminist movements is critical, full stop. And over the past 50 years, we've seen these movements lead to more egalitarian workplace regulations, more equitable land rights, better access to financial institutions, and expanded legal protections, including those for LGBTQI communities. Gender justice movements give huge social returns, yet we all know they receive very little investment, less than 1%. We've talked about that, of gender equality funding is actually reaching grassroots organizations. So we can't defund this work, right? We need to increase it. And that is the way we need to ensure that no one is left behind. And when Nimco talks about being brave, I think that is the way that we ensure that we're being brave, we're being bold, and we're getting resources where they need to be most. Thanks so much, Janet.
Thank you so much, Latanya, for breaking that down so specifically and giving it a really holistic feel as well. And, that last statement you made about so much given out and very little in return. And I think, Gabrielle, as I come to you, Faustina and Latanya have touched somewhat on something about including more individuals, whether it's the governments or other organizations. So the question to you is, Panorama's ethos is very much about co-creation and partnerships between funders. What do you think we need to do more of in terms of fueling grassroots activism in Africa?
Great. Well, thank you. This is such an important discussion. So I think the first thing to understand when we look at philanthropic funding, Latanya just mentioned that less than 1% goes to grassroots, but a very small percentage of philanthropic funding overall even goes to women's issues. So the first thing I want us to do is really try and widen the pie, because this is such an important, gender issues are underlying everything, and we need to get more funding for those issues overall. And hopefully generation equality in the next month or so is going to help raise the stakes on that. So that's the first thing. And then I think in order to get everyone kind of moving along the same lines, I think creating a catalytic coalition of all the stakeholders that are engaged in this to make sure everyone's going in the same direction. So the fact that the G7 is talking about is talking about this is critical. We need the UN agencies like the one we heard from with Vera Songwe on our last panel, philanthropic initiatives like we're going to hear about in a moment. And then once you have all of those moving along the same lines, their money needs to go to the grassroots, as we've been talking about. But we need what we call a catalytic coalition to try to make that happen. And there are just so many reasons, as we've been hearing, of why this is essential, but we need to educate the stakeholders that have the funding to make them understand that and make them understand where the money needs to go.
Thank you for that, Gabrielle. Yeah, I think it's really about creating those synergies and making sure everyone is aware and understanding how it can all come together. Alfonsina, the co-impact model is about powerful systems change. Can you tell us more about your strategy and plans for how you think the African continent can progress through using this model?
Thank you, Janet, and thank you so much. This is a fascinating and a really interesting panel. Unsurprisingly, you'll hear a lot of alignment with comments that have already been made. I think one of the main challenges that the African continent faces is similar to the challenges that the global South faces. Most of the funding reaches global North countries and then gets either re-granted to global South organizations, and usually in very unequal ways. The funding that does go to global South organizations and African organizations is largely project-based. And I think one of the shortcomings, the many shortcomings of that, is that it doesn't allow for organizations to have strategies and systemic approaches to the systemic issues that these countries are facing. Co-Impact's funding model ensures that 100% of our country-level grants, including those in Africa, go to global South-rooted and women-led organizations. We think that funding proximal, locally rooted organizations is important, not only because it's the right thing to do, but as others have mentioned, it's also because they bring the contextual knowledge, the understanding of the political economy, and the relationships needed to make that systemic change efficient and sustainable. Most of civil society in Africa, including and particularly women's rights organizations and feminist movements, are underfunded. We've already heard about this. There's one often cited study by AWID that uses the database of one of our panelists, the Global Fund for Women. And it's found that, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, almost 50% of their partners of women's rights organizations are operating on budgets of $30,000 or less. Now let that number sink in. And imagine what could really be achieved if we properly fund not projects, but a long-term vision, the dreams, the operating costs, and the strengthening of women's rights organizations and feminist activist ecosystems. I think post-recovery in Africa will require, as in everywhere, systemic, long-term, and particularly gendered analysis and solutions. We know that COVID has had a tremendous impact on women's and girls' lives. As Latanya also mentioned, the racial reckoning and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, has shone a light on a very long overdue discussion about racism and colonialist legacies, and this includes in the philanthropic and aid sectors. I think we have an opportunity and an obligation to design these recovery solutions from the bottom up, supporting organizations in the continent who are closer to the issues, not as beneficiaries or implementers, but as experts, as knowledge generators and thought partners. I think as funders, we can contribute to decolonizing philanthropy by funding African organizations in a long-term, sustainable, and direct way. Feminist futures of African women and girls cannot happen without women's rights organizations. We know from the evidence that these groups play a critical role, and in some cases, the only role, in promoting gender equality reforms. As Nimco said, the moment requires bold, brave bets. And I encourage the G7 members to take on this challenge and build more equitable and impactful aid practices. Thank you so much, Janet.
Thank you for that, Alfonsina. I think, it's about, we can see that it works, about shifting the narrative and shifting the mindset into trusting that funding grassroots women is the way to go. Emelia, the question for you, Ecobank is one of the largest banks in Africa, and you're in 36 countries. Can you give me some examples of why you think financing women-led businesses could help the continent be transformed in the coming decade?
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you to Five Foundation for this seminar. Yes, Ecobank is one of the biggest banks in Africa. We are actually in 35 countries. We have presence in 35 countries, and we have banking presence in 33. And we also have presence in the UK, in London, in Paris, and then in Dubai. Now, we believe in the empowerment of women. We say that almost half the population in Africa are women. And we also say that most SMEs, MSMEs, and the micro businesses are actually run by women. Either they are women-led, women-managed, or women-dominated. So now if we have all these people, and then we believe that empowerment can actually make a transformation, can make a change. That means that if we get all these people empowered, imagine the change, imagine the unleashing of potential that we're going to have in Africa. And so we know also that there are challenges with financing women. Most of the issues that come up, some of the issues that come up include the fact that most of these women have difficulty in accessing finance. So that's where Ecobank comes in, supporting with getting women to be able to access finance. Now, for these women, we look at women SMEs, micro businesses and everything. We do not forget those in the bottom of the pyramid. As I've heard say, the grassroots, we don't forget them at all. So we have products that are actually tailor-made for women like this. I'll give you an example of a project that we had where we were able to get women groups together through education, through financial literacy classes, help them to be able to save their own funds. And then through the saving, be able to access credit when they want. And this actually made an impact. So far, we've had about 50,000 women in just one country, Burkina Faso, that have actually, whose lives have been impacted. And using their own words, now they're able to stand on their own, and now their voice is heard in the community. We believe that investing in women is a gift that keeps on giving. And so the bank has actually made an effort intentionally to look at this sector. We also have a product that goes for the SMEs, where we take them through training, including digital training, because we don't want anybody to be left out in the train towards digitization and digitalization. And so we take them through all that. And we're working with other partners to be able to open up the world to them. So we do the training, and then we'll be able to give them financing that is suited to their purpose, and then financing that is much cheaper than what pertains elsewhere. And also, the training is important so that they actually know what it is they're going in for, and they're able to stand on their own to take the firm decisions that is going to move their businesses forward. So definitely we believe that an empowered woman is one that transforms, one that makes a whole change, a difference. So empowering women through financing their projects, financing what they want to do, but they understanding what they want to do and financing it is going to make a whole difference in the continent in the coming years.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Emelia, and for all of your answers. We are now moving into a Q&A. We have some questions for our panelists, just a few. We couldn't take that many in the interest of time. And the first one is from Nankali Maksood, Child Protection Specialist, UNICEF. I believe this one was directed once again to you, Emelia. And the question is really about how this can be done in terms of co-creating and co-funding alongside governments. How can Ecobank speak to how that model could work, driving funding by collaborating with governments and the bank to create sort of like a larger pool of donor funding? If you can speak to that. That's from Nankali, UNICEF.
Okay, yes, it is possible. I mean, I think that I talked about the fact that we work with partners, and we'll be able to do even more when you're working with government. I mean, imagine that we are in these 33 countries in Africa, and each of us is working with our government. We'll be able to definitely scale. Support from government in terms of providing access to all these women. We have women farmer groups in Ghana. These women farmer groups are under the ministries. And so if we are able to get through to them, through the ministries, definitely we are able to help to move them forward. Yes, we have the product that I spoke about earlier on, which is called Elevate. This is also a product that we can work with governments to give us access to certain facilities that we need to be able to improve on the livelihoods of the women. So definitely, yes, it is good. We can work with governments. We do work with governments. We work hand in hand with them to be able to move on. Not just governments, we work with other agencies also to improve on educating, to improve on, we provide the financing to improve on educating and to open up access to our customers, our women partners, for them to reach out to markets.
Okay. Yeah, because it's certainly a shift in the right direction if we're collaborating directly with governments. And I think there was a conversation that came up earlier about them being aligned to these goals, and so inviting them into the conversation in a big way. Gabrielle, a question here on, you talked about this approach, but what can you speak to in terms of the tools, the right tools needed in order to allow grassroots organizations to, stand at a better place to be equipped in terms of how this donor funding can come through to them? If you could speak on that briefly.
Yeah, well, I think we've heard from several of our panelists some of the tools. We just heard from Emelia some of the tools that her company provides. The Global Fund for Women provides a number of those tools. And so I think that's a really good point as donors are looking at moving to fund more grassroots organizations, making sure there's technical assistance and training available to make sure that the groups can make the most of their money and do their very best work. But I do think there are quite a few good tools available currently.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. Latanya, a question here about accessibility, right? It's great that grassroots women are driving change. Just your thoughts on how possible it is for accessibility to be there from organizations, because accessibility really across the board seems to be the challenge. And I'll throw that to you, Latanya, and invite anyone else to speak on the accessibility factor. Your thoughts?
Yeah, and just sort of bouncing off what Emelia and Gabrielle was saying, about the getting the resources to the grassroots. We do understand, and I think all of us here, that sometimes structures and systems in place for both the government funding as well as philanthropic government doesn't allow for them to actually get funding directly to grassroots groups. But there are so many ways, and again, Global Fund and its sister funds have been doing this for 30 plus years, right, to get the money directly to the grassroots organizations, even if you yourself can't physically write a check, or provide other resources. There are mechanisms and ways that these relationships exist, and we have to capitalize on that. And so when we talk about accessibility, I assume that the question is around accessing funds. And I, have been speaking on this, and many of you are my friends here, but we shouldn't put the onus on grassroots organizations to find us. We have been and I've been in this development field for a long time, right? And our trend is the same. We decide somewhere in DC or somewhere in London what our strategy is, and then we tell people that through some kind of RFP, and then they're forced to kind of go through hundreds and hundreds of RFPs and see what's practical. For a Global Fund for Women, we know for sure that is not the way we should be finding them. We have the resources, we have tools to be able to find grassroots organizations in countries around the world. Again, 177 is where, Global Fund for Women is. We can find them, we can build those relationships, we can find out what their strategies are and what they're doing, and then we can connect them to the resources. I think it's a shame that in 2021, we still feel like the only way to reach grassroots organizations is through RFPs. I think that's unfair. I think the work they've been doing on the ground is so important and so special for long-term sustainable change that we really have to be there for them and not the other way around and have them looking for us. Hundreds of proposals are going in and they maybe only get one or two funded, and that time and resources could have been spent actually with people in the field getting the work done.
Yeah, really well said, Latanya. As we come to the end of this, Faustina, Alfonsina, it's been said by all of you, by all panelists, but what do you hope grassroots-led organizations watching this can take home from this conversation and can take home from sort of like renewed commitments and urgency in terms of funding them? What do you hope they can take home from here? And do you think they have a sense of hope that perhaps things can change for them? We can start with you, Faustina, and then Alfonsina can finish off as well.
Absolutely. I would like that message for them to take home that, things have changed. It's not business as usual. Organizations like CIFF and other philanthropic organizations are wanting to work differently, have different partnerships, and are willing to also help where we need to strengthen their capacity or strengthen their systems to be able to receive funding from organizations like us. We want them to engage with us. We will come looking for them, as Latanya was saying, because we really do believe that, they have the solutions for a self-determining Africa, an Africa that, has unlocked 50% of our population, which is the girls and women who will take the continent to the next level. And so please engage, come and talk to us. Tell us your ideas, tell us your solutions. We want to know, we want to walk down this path with you.
Thank you, Faustina. Alfonsina.
Well, I hope that first they feel seen and heard. I mean, I think what everybody has said is it's people who are locally rooted, who are living the situations that they are, who know what the solutions are. So hopefully there, as Faustina said, there's some hope. I do feel, however, we're 25 years after Beijing when gender equality was centered on public agendas, and yet there is no funding. Not only there's very little funding for gender equality, and even less than 1% of that going to women's rights and feminist movements. So I actually, as Latanya said, I'm not going to put the onus on the grassroots organizations and reiterate that I think I'm actually going to take back what I had said. And I don't think that it's brave to fund these organizations. I think it's just the most efficient and smart way to do it. So hopefully that's what the grassroots organizations can hear, that it's not a brave move to fund them. It's not a risky move. It's actually quite the opposite.
Yeah, and a necessary one at that. Well, thank you all so very much for the work you do and trusting grassroots organizations. I feel like they needed to hear this, and I'm so glad it's part of this conversation this year. Thank you very much for your time and your energy, and we'll hand it right back over to the rest of the event. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janet.